folks, and welcome to the channel, or welcome back. And in part number 1 we intended to replace the rack and pinion on the MGB GT, and we also intended to do the wheel alignment. But while we were doing the work, we noticed that the front suspension, the front brakes and the cross member could actually use some tender loving care. So we decided to remove the complete cross member. So now I had to create a part number 2. And in part number 2, we're going to do several different things, and hopefully I can get it all done. So let me explain to you shortly what we're going to do, and then we will get into action. So here it is, the complete front cross member with the suspension and the brakes. So I have already disassembled all the parts, so now I can start cleaning it, because that's the first thing I'm going to do. But as you might notice, I keep everything together where it belongs, so I try not to mix parts, and that's why I always lay them out on a piece of cardboard. So what I've taken apart is, first of all, the cross member. This is the cross member. That's the one we're going to blast and repaint and clean it all up and check it out. We also have removed the lower wishbones on both sides together with the springs, and those will be renewed, and you'll see that in the video very soon. We also have then the actual shock absorbers, but this is actually the Costello suspension, which is going on the top, which is replacing the original damper. We've got the anti-roll bar, we've got the steering house, of course, and then we have the uprights on the left and on the right with the disc brakes and the calipers on it. We're going to take the calipers off, and we're going to clean them all up and check them out. We're also going to change the brake hoses while we are at it, because that's a low-cost item, and the ones that are on there are not that good. And that's about all we're going to do with this, and that's going to take a little bit of time, especially the cleaning up and the repainting and all that. And once all that is done, then we're going to put it back onto the vehicle. Before I did some new heat wrapping on the exhaust, because now I have easy access to it. And you'll see all that very soon. And once all that is done, then we will finally install the new rack and pinion and then align the wheels. But in between, I'm going to show you as well the rack and pinion that came out of the car, and how you can do repairs on yours if yours was not up for replacement. You might just do some small fixes, adjust the pressure of the pinion, or even correct the tie rods that they don't fall down loosely. They need to be a little bit stiff, and I show you on how you can actually check that, including the small spring which is inside. So with any further ado, I'm going to start with the cross member. So this is the cross member, or the subframe as I call it sometimes, of the MG, and this one looks in a pretty good shape. I have checked it all over. There's no cracks or serious deformation on it, so I think this is still reusable. So I'm going to shot blast that and then paint it with some anti-rust paint that they typically use in the construction world for steel beams. There is not a lot of rust or anything which is rusted through. There's some surface rust here and there, but that should be okay. Now cleaning it, that's easy. You can use whatever you want. You can use a steel brush on your drill, and I might have to do that in some areas, or you shot blast it if you can. Shot blast, of course. And I'm going to shot blast it, but what I noticed is that on the bottom here, there are some areas that have been coated with this elastic coat. I don't know if you can see it, but here we have some elastic coat on it, undercoating on cars, and that is very elastic, and you can't really shot blast that. So that has to be a mechanical removal with a steel brush. So let me set all this up, and then I'll show you on how I'm blasting this, and then I'm going to show you what I'm going to do with it afterwards by painting it, and with what kind of paint I'm going to do this. Now, of course, this is not a high quality paint job. You need to do it underneath the car, so you can do this outside or in a paint booth. It doesn't really matter. You can even do it with a brush if you want. Alright, so let's start. Taking off the old paint and the wax coat on this old cross member isn't a lot of fun, and for that I'm first using a steel brush or this other type on my drill, and that way I can get most of it off. What I often do is, while I'm actually rubbing it down, these little threads of the brushes, they tend to move into one direction. And after a while, I actually change the direction of my drill in the other direction, and then it bites better again. So let me start cleaning this up, and then we'll see how good it goes. I'm going to start with the first brushing wheel, which is kind of a 90 degrees brushing wheel. And as you can see, it doesn't come off very easily, but we get it off. Afterwards I will blast it. Now I'm going to change the rotation of my brush, and you'll see how much easier that goes sometimes. So I guess you've seen that this is going a lot faster because now I'm rotating in the counter direction of these little steel wires. And after a while I switch back to the other side, and that way it moves pretty quick. So if the bite is stopping, then I just switch the direction of my drill, and then it's going to bite again. And that's how I keep switching back and forth. So let me finish this up and then you'll see the final result. Most of the gummy stuff and the old paint I took off with the steel brush, so now I'm going to blast it for its final finish. But again, if you cannot blast, then you just continue and you just use another brush and get all the little pieces off. You will have the same result at the end, but it might take a little bit longer. I'm not going to blast too long in front of the camera because it causes a lot of dust, but I'm using a really fine grit which is called Garnet, and that works real well. So as you can see, this is creating a very smooth finish, so I'm going to continue with this and then you'll see the final result. And here's our cross member now completely finished, and I think this is looking more than good enough. And I had no surprises because sometimes you can have surprises when you blast that you actually have holes, but in this case everything was quite alright. So now I'm going to paint this, and the paint that I'm going to use is black glossy paint, which is used for steel beams in construction work, and it's very rust resistant, so that should be just perfect to coat this cross member. So before we go into paint it, we're going to give it a pretty good rub so we have no more grease on it, and you'll see how much junk will still come off. See that? So let me clean this up completely and then we're going to paint it. So while the cross member is drying in the paint booth, we're going to work on the brake calipers. Now the brake calipers on this MG are not the original brake calipers. So I'm going to take them off, we're going to blast them as well and then paint them all over again because they really look a little bit tacky. The brake caliper that we have on the MG here is actually from a Princess, and it's a 4-pot brake caliper. So the first thing I'm going to do now is to remove the brake pads, and I guess it depends on your car what you have. It might be different. You may have the original calipers, but it doesn't really matter what you have. These calipers are almost always the same. They differ a little bit in shape and form, but it's not that difficult to work on them. So now it's time to remove the brake pads, and they're a bit caught because these pistons are being pushed out on the calipers, so I need to push them back a bit first. And as you can see, they seem to be quite dirty. I don't think it's rust. Let's see. I think it's just grease and dirt. Maybe not. We'll see. If I need to replace them, I will replace them. But I think for the moment, we probably can clean them up. So I'm going to spray them a little bit so they move easier backwards. They are not leaking, so that's a good point. Now, of course, if this is on the car, it's a bit easier to get it out than on a table. I think this is going to clean up nicely. It's not really rusted or corroded. It's just a lot of debris on it because I think these brakes, though the pads have been worn for quite a while, so that's probably why we see this. All right. Let's clean all this up as much as we can. And I'll try to get the brake pads out. If I can get this in there, then I should be able to push them back a little bit. Yeah, I think they went back slightly. There we go, we got one out. And it seems that these are the DS3000 race pads, so we'll put the same pads back. All right, so that should work. Almost. A little bit more. It's playing with me. Now it should work. There we go. And it's out. And that's where the pistons are. So let's spray them a little more, clean them up a little bit before we push them back. Of course, the back side I cannot clean. I'm just using some WD-40 for this, guys, just in case you were wondering what I was spraying on it. All right, let's spray some more. All right, so let's see if I can push those back a bit more. And I can. Now I'm having, of course, this hose still here, which is now going to squirt brake fluid out of it. So I'm going to put that in a pot so I don't spill brake fluid all over my table. Let me put that in there. Okay, so let's squeeze them back. It is squeezed quite all right, and I'm quite happy about that, because if they were seized, then I would have to recondition those as well. But I knew that because the car was still braking fine, although it could use some new brake pads. All right. Oh, the top one is a little bit more tough. Okay, it's also moving. You don't want to scratch the sides. So the next thing is to remove the brake caliper from the upright, and there's only 2 bolts in the back, so that shouldn't be all that hard. That's number 1. And that's number 2. All right, now it should just come apart. Okay. I have both calipers removed from the uprights, so now I'm just going to shot blast them, and then we spray them with brake caliper paint. But I still want to mention something about the brake hose. Now this hose here well, it had its best time, as you can see. So I'm going to replace it. And there's a lot of debate always about brake hoses. Right here I have a stainless steel braided one. Very good quality. But this is an issue for the MOT in Belgium for some awkward reason. Here I have a typical standard rubber type, and that's most likely the one I'm going to fit to avoid problems in the MOT. Although I would prefer the braided one. Now, there's a lot of debate on this amongst technical people that like to discuss about brake pipes. The advantage of a stainless steel braided hose pipe is that it's very strong. So even an impact of a rock or something, it's not going to cut the rubber, so you're not going to have a leak very quickly. So these are really, really good. However, you can't see if there is a little crack in the rubber inside, because there's still rubber inside, so you can't see that. And that's most likely the reason why the MOT doesn't allow us to fit these, because they can't see the state of the rubber actually inside. But again, I think it's silly, but okay, it is what it is. Now on the rubber types, you can actually see what the state is of that rubber, right? And they are very flexible, but they are more sensitive to cuts. So they are not as strong, they are not as protective as the stainless steel braided one. And they have another big problem, these. If you really put a lot of force on your brakes, they tend to balloon, they tend to expand, because they are not constrained very well with steel around like the braided one. So they're going to go open a bit, just like a balloon. So you're going to lose some braking force onto your caliper. But then again, that's only in extreme conditions if you really push very hard. So overall, I don't think it really matters for a road car or even a fast road car what you're going to put. If I'm going to put my MG on the track, then certainly I'm going to go for the braided one. So I still haven't made up my mind yet. I know I'm going to be in trouble at the technical inspection if I use this one. But that looks really cool, doesn't it? Anyhow, we'll see later. Now it's time to clean it all up. And here they are, cleaned up, so now ready to be painted. And I'm going to paint them with Caliper Paint Silver from Motip. That always has worked fine for me. Not that I'm making a commercial for them, but if things are good, I might as well say it. And it's not that I'm getting sponsored or anything, because nobody sponsors me. So while the other pieces are drying, we can have a look on the rack and pinion that came out of the MGB. This is the one with the excessive play. So the first thing we're going to do is do a quick check on what the ratio is on this one. And remember that we used the pen before in part number 1. We put a mark on the rod which is going to the steering column and on the housing. And then we turn it extremely to the left and extremely to the right, and we count how many turns. So I made a mark. So I also will make a mark here, so then you can actually see it, or I hope you can see it. So let's turn. So that's 1 turn. That is 2 turns. That is 3 turns. And now we have 3 1/4 turn, which is quite a bit more than 275 on the other rack that we are going to put in. So the original steering rack has 3 1/2 turns to have the full deflection from the wheels from the extreme left to the extreme right. So you will have to turn on the steering wheel 3 1/2 turns to do that. The new rack and pinion that I have is only 2.75 turns. So it's going to be far more direct, but it's going to be a little bit heavier to turn. So the bigger the ratio is, the easier it is to turn on the steering wheel. but the less reaction you have. So if you like direct contact with the road, you like a direct feeling, then go for a low ratio. If you like to be a bit more relaxed and less effect when you turn the wheel, then go for a higher ratio. So now let's have a look on the rack and pinion itself, what this is all about, where you can adjust the play on it. And then we're going to look on the tie rods, because that's also something that could go wrong. And maybe yours, you can still repair it if you have play on it. Mine was beyond repair. I can recondition it, but yours might be repairable. Maybe you just have a very small problem with it. So let us have a look. So let's have a look on the rack and the pinion now. So I'm going to disconnect the gaiter and already removed the bands that were on there, so I can slide it back easily. And this is actually your rack. So if I turn the steering wheel, you can see that the rack is moving left and right. And these are teeth in the rack, basically, and the pinion is inside, and it grabs in those teeth, so whenever you turn the steering rod, the pinion will actually move the rack forward and backward, because the teeth of the pinion are grabbing into the grooves of the rack. One of the issues you could have is that there's actually play where the tie rod connects to the rack. Now that joint should be fairly stiff. If you see this, that's no good. It should not fall down by itself. It should actually stay up. And this is really loose, and if it's that loose, you need to tighten that up. But before we do so, we're going to take this side apart so you can see what's inside. If you want to remove the tie rod from the rack, then you need to loosen up this part and the front part, and that can be tough. There is no grabbing area on that one, but I'm always using a big wrench for that, so you would have to put it up there and then turn it. I already loosened it up because you have to put some force on it sometimes. But let me open it up now and see. So this one you can turn off anti-clockwise, and then we'll have a look what's inside. All right. So here we have a little pivoting point. Here it is. See that? This is this little part right here that sits on this little ball, and that's where it pivots on. But then this part sits actually on a spring which is inside. And let me see if I can get it out. And here is that spring. Now it's not uncommon to see that this spring is broken. If that spring is broken, then you will have a lot of play, so then you need to get a new spring. So if you're going to recondition your own rack, then get the new spring and then tighten all this up. And I'm just going to tighten this back up now so you can actually see how it goes. Make sure you put the parts in the right order. Let's see if I can get this in there. Oops. It's always a bit difficult with the camera. I don't want to be in the way. Alright, so now that is apparently in, right? But it's not in place yet, because look how loose that is. So now I'm going to move this big ring in the back a bit backward. Now I can tighten that up a bit more. And I can already start feeling the tension, so just look at. See how stiff this becomes already? So once you have more or less the stiffness you want to get, you will have to get a second wrench over here so you can squeeze the two together, right? So now let's look on how you can adjust the play between the rack and the pinion. Now the bottom cover, if you take that one off, then oil will come out, because this is filled with oil, don't forget that, right? So if you take the bottom part off, oil will come out. So we need to remove the top cover here, and I don't know if this one will have spacers or not, but let's see. I haven't taken this apart yet, so let's see. All right, there we go. And you can see that there is actually here a shim, and that's the one that you can actually remove or add one to adjust the play. And I'm going to try to get this out. There we go. And here you have that piston which is pushing down with this piece of copper here. See that? and this little spring inside, so that spring could be broken. You might want to replace that one. And this piece of copper can really be worn out. And if you look on this one, I don't know if you can see it, but this is actually worn quite a bit right there in the middle. So that's why I had a lot of play on it. I'm going to try to show you how much play we have. So have a look on this marking here. Right? So I'm going to hold this in place, and I'm going to lift a bit the rack now. See how much I can move this back and forth without the rack being moving? That's play. If I push the rack all the way down, then I don't have that play. So this is the kind of pressure you need to apply by pushing down the rack onto the pinion. And that's the role of this little copper bush. And that often goes wrong. So that little piece of brass that you see underneath my dial is actually the part that pushes down the rack onto the pinion. And in the middle, it's worn out. Now I zeroized it on the high side, so let me move it to the low side where the wear and tear is. And you can see already that my needle deflected almost up to 0.80, which is actually 0.2 millimeters. So I have a wear and tear of 0.2 millimeters just on that piece alone. And you will feel that. If I was to recondition my rack and pinion, I would first of all get new springs. New springs for both the tie rods on both sides, and I would also get a new spring for the pressure onto the rack, onto the pinion, which is the one that goes inside as we have seen before. So that one is actually fitted in here together with that brass piece which I have over here. And we know that brass piece is already worn out, so you want to get a new brass piece like this. If you were to recondition the car, of course. You might not want to, but if you do, that's what you should do. Now assume that we have a new brass piece, and of course this brass piece is really worn, but let's assume we have a new one. Then we're going to put the spring inside, and then we put it all back together into this kind of a piston kind of thing, and there's a hole right there, so we can push that in there, and then we should be good. And then we can put it all back together. And you can see this is kind of curved. This should go around the rack, really. So let me put that up, and then we'll see on the pressure. I just need to make sure I fit it right. And I move it around a bit. There we go. It has settled. So now you can see that pressure we can apply, and depending on how much pressure we apply, the more or less play we're going to have. But the pressure is really applied by putting the top plate up. This one right here. So if you're using a washer of a certain thickness, you will vary the pressure. So if these things are worn, like in my case, then I might just want to remove this washer and do it without a washer. And this is how it's been done. So let's see. I'll put it up, and I'm not going to use the washer this time. And we'll feel what the play is on this. Now I have no oil in it, I have to say. Don't forget, you should always have oil in this, and I tend to use gearbox oil for this. And then you want to feel, see now, see, I can't even move it anymore, so this is way too much. And this is how you have to check it. I don't know of any good measurement you could do up front to define how big or how thin the washer should be, or the spacer. I think you should have a couple to try it out. Now it might be that the copper part has turned a bit, so well, now I can move back and forth easily. Or I'm going to put back the shim or the spacer or whatever we want to call it. And then I'm going to lock it down again, assuming that now we have a brand new brass push cup there inside. And I don't know if you've seen it, but I turn it in the other direction. The non-worn direction is now sitting on top of the rack. So let's see. I'm not going to tighten it down all the way. You see now this moves still nicely, and I'm going to tighten this down because that's what I should really do. Yep, that feels good. And that's just because I have turned around that brass cup inside. So the non-worn part is now resting on the rack and it's pushing it down. And as you've seen, it's not a lot of wear and tear, but it's enough to have play. So the rack and pinion is a piece of cake. You can rebuild it yourself. It's very simple. If your tie rods are dropping down by themselves, then obviously you have too much play on the joint here. Then you need to tighten that up. Check the spring inside. Maybe that spring is broken. Maybe some parts inside are broken. Who knows? But that's easy to fix. You can get new gaiters, not a problem. If you have too much play between the rack and the pinion, open up the cover. Check that brass cup inside. I always say copper, but it's a brass cup. Check that cup for wear and tear. Get a new one if you can get one. It's not always possible, but if you can get one, put a new one in. Also, the little spring might be wrong. Get a new spring inside as well. Once you've done that, then you put it back together and figure out what kind of a spacer you need to have here, or a washer of a certain thickness, so you have the right pressure between the rack and the pinion, so you have no play. That's all there is to it. And then, of course, at the end, you've got to make sure that you fill it up with oil. And I'm always filling it up with oil when it's out of the car because it's so easy. You can also fill it up with oil when it's in the car, but it's a little bit more difficult. But that's it. So now let's do something else. We're going to work on the suspension because I'm going to rebuild the lower wishbone.